Hey, welcome back to the series on upzoning. This is video number 5 in the series, and I'll put the link in the description to the article that I'm reading here and commenting and correlating with the other 10 videos in this series, and then of course culminating with a conclusion where I share, the high-level takeaways. So what we have here is an article from curbed.com. Title is Will Upzoning Neighborhoods Make Homes More Affordable? Now, this is a little bit longer, but I feel it's going to be a good article. Then we've got some shorter ones coming up and some really good articles coming up as well. All right, here, subtitle is Cities and States Across the Country Are Proposing New Upzoning Laws to Combat the Housing Crisis. Will they work? Housing affordability, I guess I should say this is an article from January 30th, 2020 by Diana Buds. And here we go. So housing affordability is a growing issue in America, and there's a battle over how to fix it happening on blocks across the country. Zoning, the rules that govern how cities use their land, is on the front line. Between 1986 and 2017, the median price of single-family housing in the U.S. rose from 370% of the median U.S. household yearly income to 410%. That's pretty significant. I would have thought it would be more, to be honest. Again, that's from 86 to 2017. According to the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, 11 million Americans households spent more than half their paychecks on rent and utilities. Yikes. And the number of cost-burdened renters is on the rise, especially among middle-income households. The percentage of super commuters, meaning those who travel more than 90 minutes each way to work, has skyrocketed. Almost nowhere in the United States is it possible for a minimum wage worker to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. I totally buy that. I don't know how people are doing it. Each year, an estimated 2.5 to 3.5 million people experience homelessness. Progressive coastal cities and rural America alike are experiencing shortage of affordable housing. Recently, policymakers at the state and local levels across the country have zeroed in on a culprit: zoning that limits development to single-family detached houses in large swaths of America, from the east and west coasts to the Midwest. Lawmakers are beating the drum for upzoning, which means changing single-family zoning codes to allow taller and denser housing, like duplexes, triplexes, accessory dwelling units, and apartment buildings. In the last few years, upzoning legislation has been introduced or passed in California, Oregon, Washington, Seattle, Minneapolis, Nebraska, Virginia, and Maryland. The federal government has also expressed interest in pressing local governments to relax zoning laws that prohibit multifamily housing. I think a lot of the influence and money are coming from the federal government. Remember, when the federal government gives these states and cities money, there are a lot of strings attached, and generally, from what I can see, there's a lot of influence at the federal level, and not all of it has residents and Americans' best interest at heart. There's a lot of money to be made in creating narratives that promote certain things over others, and don't be naive to believe that there's not a vested interest by the powers that be to go a certain direction. I'll leave it at that. You know what I'm talking about. Let me continue here. This week, California legislators failed to advance SB 50, one of the most high-profile upzoning bills to date, which proposed adding density near transit. But is upzoning enough to alleviate the housing shortage? The answer to that question, it's important to know how single-family zoning became perceived as the norm for housing and how that's fueling the affordability crisis. A brief history of zoning in America. At its most basic, zoning determines what can be built on a parcel of land and how much building is allowed. That's density. And what the parcel of land can be used for is land use. So two things in play: land use and density. Zoning is the primary way cities manage and regulate land. It varies in complexity from place to place and can either mandate specific uses, such as in New York City's mandatory inclusionary housing that requires affordable units in all new development, or prohibit them, like exclusionary zoning ordinances that once enforced segregation. The widespread adoption of zoning codes in the United States began in the early 20th centuries as 20th century as cities were urbanizing rapidly. Zoning laws were created to prevent nuisances like factories from entering desirable neighborhoods, an early form of not in my backyard. When Los Angeles enacted its first municipal zoning ordinance in 1904, it prohibited, quote, any public laundry or wash house from entering residential districts. Okay. In 1908, LA divided all land into residential and industrial districts, making it the first place to zone citywide. In 1916, this is an interesting history of what zoning is, right? I mean, it's valuable to look back and see what's been done so that we can, make informed decisions moving forward. In 1916, New York City enacted the first comprehensive municipal zoning code after concern about skyscrapers blocking light and air and a boom in speculative development. Cramped and overcrowded areas of the city were portrayed by social reformers as unhealthy and dirty. Okay. A description with clear racial overtones. I don't necessarily see racial overtones in unhealthy and dirty, but maybe some do. Since these were once areas where immigrants lived and less dense areas where light and air could enter were viewed as healthier and safer. It's more difficult to keep a mixed district containing stores and dwellings clean and sanitary than a residential districts, the city commissioner on building districts reported in 1916. Through the 1920s, it was common for neighborhoods to include a variety of housing types: detached single-family houses, duplexes, apartments, bungalow courts, and commercial uses like corner stores. But as zoning took off, it established primary uses for neighborhoods, which sometimes segregated their populations too. The few experts who completed zoning codes in their cities were called upon to consult on codes elsewhere. Their segregationist views came with them, even though the Supreme Court declared racial zoning unconstitutional in 1917. That's an interesting bit of history. Robert Whitten, co-author of New York City's 1960 16 zoning ordinance and president of the American City Planning Institute, believed that bankers and leading businessmen should live in one part of town, storekeepers, clerks, and technicians in another, and working people in yet others, where they would enjoy the association with neighbors more or less of their own kind, right? Interesting take. He also worked on the 1922 zoning code for Atlanta, which helped pave the way for the segregation that continues to define that city. Okay. Heartland Bartholomew, the planner who developed St. Louis's 1916 zoning code with the goal of preventing movement into finer residential districts by colored people. Ouch. Yeah, that's it doesn't get any clearer than that. Was hired to consult on over 500 zoning codes and comprehensive plans over the course of his career, including those for Pittsburgh, New Orleans, Kansas City, Seattle, Louisville, and Washington, D.C. Amid a growing labor movement in 1919, more than 4 million workers participated in strikes. Industrialists also pushed for homeownership as a way to keep workers happy and more dependent on their jobs, right? That's where we get the mortgage, right? The death note. Hard to get out of that one. Harder these days. Let me continue. The man owns his home, but in a sense, his home owns him, checking his rash impulses. Years ago, I read Jay Leno's book, and he talked about that too when he was on the come up, right? And he said, hey, the more you shackle yourself to jobs and buying things and family and stuff like that early on, the more you basically lock yourself in and you put yourself in golden handcuffs, so think long and hard before you make any kind of big decision like that. That's true. He wrote a book in 1919 called Good Homes Make Contented Workers. Around the same time, the federal government began promoting single-family detached houses as a way to fight communism and promote capitalism in response to the Red Scare. President Coolidge wrote a 1922 essay called A Nation of Homeowners, which promoted single-family detached houses in a patriotic ideal. This ideology continued under Hoover, who in 1927 praised the growth of suburban neighborhoods. The tremendous post-war expansion of suburban areas with detached houses, which the development of the automobile has helped make possible, is one of the finest achievements of the present period of increased national prosperity, end quote. The single family was put on a pedestal, says Jenny Schutz, a Brookings Institute expert on urban economics and housing policy. It was single family neighborhoods should have single family detached homes, and a lot of this is about preserving the property values of those homes. Single family residential zoning was about keeping away things that are considered undesirable uses, which might lower property values. There was also some pretty blatant intent to exclude lower income families, renters, and non-white families. Interesting. Zoning now makes it illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home on most residential land in many of the American cities with the most competitive housing markets and strongest job growth, according to a recent New York Times analysis. Detached single-family homes account for 75% of all land zoned for residential use in Los Angeles, 94% in San Jose, California, 81% in Seattle, 77% in Portland, Oregon, and 70% in Minneapolis. In areas with high demand for new housing, some lawmakers and economists believe single-family zoning is a clear restriction on supply, which is driving the price of housing up. And remember what we talked about and learned in some of the other articles, that supply may not be the largest factor driving the price of housing up. What some urban planners have realized is that it's the price of the land, right? How desirable is the city? How many people want to live there? So that's a factor. What is upzoning and why are lawmakers proposing it? In response to the growing housing, let me see how close we are here. Yeah, this is a long article, but it's going to be good here. We'll get through it. In response to the growing housing affordability crisis, policymakers in many cities and states are trying to figure out how to add more housing. The challenge is that buildings occupy most of the land in cities. Upzoning opens the capacity for this land for more housing. There's also a climate case for upzoning. Building housing closer to transportation and jobs mean people have to travel shorter distances to work and shop, lowering vehicle miles traveled and potentially allowing them to use public transportation and walk in lieu of cars. And you know how I feel about climate change. We're told to suck it up and live closer and ride bikes and do all the things that will help alleviate climate change. But the wealthy and the leaders of our country and world, they're flying around on private jets, live out in the country, own gas guzzling vehicles. So I'm not buying the fact that we got to suck it up and they can do whatever they want. I'm not down with it. Upzoning means changing the zoning code to allow taller and denser buildings. This is different from a rezoning, which in addition to allowing bigger construction, changes land use, like the New York City rezonings of the Williamsburg and Greenpoint industrial waterfront to residential. It increases the buildable capacity of land, creating the opportunity to increase supply. As Christopher Herbert, managing director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, explains it, as long as there is sufficient demand for housing, developers will build. The price of land, the cost to build a home, and what the market is willing to pay for a home all factor into a developer's math. If the cost of land is low enough that the developer can earn a profit, then the developer will build. See, this is one thing. In these articles, we're also finding that cities often ask too much of zoning ordinances, right? That's just one small factor. There are many other factors that determine what developers will do, right? They're not stupid people. They're not going to just start building like crazy because they have to have a return on their investment. It's a business, right? By increasing the number of units that can be built on each parcel, upzoning lowers the cost of land per unit. But there's a caveat. There's a hope that if we upzone this land worth $1 million and now we can put 2 units on it, the land cost is $500,000 per unit, Herbert says. But as soon as you tell me I can put 2 units there, it's going to affect the price of the land. It becomes more valuable. See, that's where property taxes go up. Your land is more valuable. The city's going to say, hey, your property taxes are going up. And if you're a renter, your rent's going to go up. A study published in January 2019 in the journal Urban Affairs Review analyzed the impact of new upzoning policies Chicago passed in 2013 and 2015 that allowed denser housing near transit stops. stops. The study concluded that over a 5-year time span, upzoning didn't increase housing supply, but it did increase land values. Ouch, that is key right there. So remember that. Proponents of upzoning argue that allowing denser construction will encourage more housing supply, and as more supply enters the market, housing will become more affordable through the filtering effect, which even high-priced new housing can lower rents for lower-income residents by reducing the competition for homes. Okay, more supply, less price, right? More competition. One challenge with this approach is that added capacity doesn't necessarily translate into added construction because developers don't always choose to build. See what I was telling you about? They're not just going to start building because they're smart and they study the specifics of what's going on. They have to make a profit, right? It's a business. Additionally, the housing market is so severely pressured in different areas that the filtering effect is highly unpredictable. Historically, upzoning has been used on a case-by-case basis in cities. When Washington, D.C. was planning its metro expansion in the 60s, for example, Arlington, Virginia decided to upzone the areas within a half-mile of new stations, resulting in 7 mixed-use walkable neighborhoods that are now in heavy demand. See, I'm all for that, like going on a case-by-case basis. I'm not for like the blanket upzoning of cities. I think that's just very dangerous and just like opens the floodgates for all sorts of problems and collateral damage. Recent legislation in upzone single-family residential areas in Mass focuses on so-called missing middle housing, right? We heard that term in the NPR article. That was video number 4, a term coined in 2010 by Berkeley-based architect Daniel Perolek, which includes accessory dwelling units, duplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and bungalow courts. These housing types fall somewhere between single-family homes and mid-rise multifamily buildings. When designed thoughtfully, missing middle housing adds density without dramatically changing the character of a neighborhood. I buy that. Designed thoughtfully. That's been my whole argument this whole series. Let's look at specific situations in a conscious, thoughtful way so that we design appropriate things, appropriate buildings. And here's a quote: the sort of gentle density increases that are being proposed now, we haven't actually seen that much. End quote. Schutz says, some recent attempts at increasing density will be closely watched in coming years to see what effect they have on housing supply and costs. Minneapolis 2040 plan, which passed the city council in October 2019, allows duplexes and triplexes in all single-family neighborhoods and permits 5 and 10-story buildings along transit corridors. So that's interesting. Because estimating the market's response to these changes is unpredictable, the city doesn't know how much construction these changes will lead to, though it predicts that areas near universities, transit parks, trails, and retail will see more development first. The general policy here was to ensure as much land use flexibility as practicable, says Heather Worthington, Minneapolis Director of Long Range Planning. Oregon's House Bill 2001, which passed in July 2019, see, all these cities are doing it. This is a big topic. Legalizes duplex on all single-family zoned land in cities with populations over 10,000. In cities over 25,000, the bill legalizes triplexes, fourplexes, attached townhomes, and some cottage clusters in areas zoned single-family residential. That's a lot of density. October also saw changes in California. Governor Newsom signed several housing bills, included AB 68, which allows 1 ADU and 1 junior ADU on lots zoned for single-family residential. So that's 2 ADUs on 1 lot. Impressive. Cambridge, Massachusetts is considering an affordable housing overlay, which means allowing upzoning only if the new units are 100% affordable. See, good luck, government, like getting involved in the affordability game. That's a whole mess, if you ask me. The biggest proposed upzoning legislation to date is California's SB 50, which in late January failed to receive enough votes to move the measure forward, also known as the More Homes Act. It called for cities and municipalities to add more housing near transit hubs, proposed by State Senator Scott Wiener. The bill offered local governments the option to create their own plans or use a default zoning plan from the state. The bill also included requirements that local plans pair low-income housing development with market rate development, a mandatory inclusionary provision. I'm never a big fan of this like blending things. I'm just more of like let the market choose what's going to happen. I've never seen when the government gets involved. That's why I'm so critical of uh, government solutions, right? We saw it with housing projects, horrible places to live, absolutely horrible. They don't even take into account anything that human beings need. We see it with Section 8. Does that work? I don't know, right? I mean, there are so many factors in play, and the government seem to come up with a simple solution and say, oh, this will work. And I've just seen a bunch of collateral damage that follow in the wake of that, in those decisions. I'm very skeptical of their solutions and would have removed parking minimums. Another provision forbade the demolition of buildings that have housed renters in the past 7 years, because that is a data point that is difficult to quantify, and there's currently no way to measure that provision. Predicting what the overall impact of SB 50 could have been is very difficult, according to experts at UC Berkeley's Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Fundamentally, upzoning is making it legal to build the kind of housing we used to build, says Brian Hanlow, an advocate for expanded rental housing construction and the president and CEO of California YIMBY. Let's go back here. Of California YIMBY, an organization that co-sponsored SB 50. We're not talking about building skyscrapers. We're talking about building the type of walkable, missing middle housing Californians used to build until we stopped building it. And that was when the crisis skyrocketed. These old neighborhoods that were really nice, we should be building more of them. There was no guarantee, however, that SB 50 would result in upzoning that looks like older neighborhoods. Local land conditions and existing parcel size will determine what can be constructed. A recent report from the Turner Center for Housing Innovation and the Urban Displacement Project, two research groups at the University of California, Berkeley, explored how local factors might have influenced SB 50's impact. It concluded that because builders will have to work around small parcel sizes in existing buildings, Manhattanization of areas is unlikely. In December 2019, Virginia Del Ibrahim Samira introduced HB 152, which would allow duplexes to be built on any land in the state zoned for single-family residential without any special permitting requirements. Most new housing in Virginia is suburban sprawl, which contributes to longer commutes, more carbon emissions, and increased expenditure on municipal services like police, water, fire, and sewage, since service area and cost expand significantly with sprawl. So that's something to take a note of too, right? We have to be conscious of that. I've heard that before, that as sprawl goes on, it's more expensive to build outside in a suburb than it is to build interior in the city. Samira believes upzoning will help municipalities add housing without increasing infrastructure costs. He also believes that upzoning would increase the value of a homeowner's properties, since they would be able to build a second unit on land to generate rental income. See, it does increase property values, and the city's never going to tell you that up front, because you will pay higher property taxes, right? If you want that. I don't want that. Let's see. However, some might argue that distance from neighbors is what people will pay more for, and the added units could detract from neighborhoods as a whole. That's a factor. Absolutely. I buy that. The state legislature tabled the bill on January 23rd, which means it might come up for a debate in the future. According to Delegate Samira, the current way affordable housing is constructed in his state isn't working. There are a lot of let's see here. There are a lot of very expensive solutions to our housing crisis in Virginia, and it seems like throwing money at the problem is the solution, he tells Curb. People are advocating for housing trust fund money to develop affordable housing, and it's led to very modest results in affordable housing. The same with incentivizing developers to set aside affordable units. Since its inception in 2012, the Virginia Housing Trust Fund has contributed money to 47 projects that have created or preserved 3,000 affordable units. Inspired by Oregon's upzoning bill, Nebraska State Senator Matt Hansen introduced one of his own in his state in January 2020 called the Missing Middle Housing Act. Whether you're a high population state or not, restrictive single family zoning will be common, he says. Curbed, the bill is a creative solution to our affordable housing shortage that addresses one of the main drivers of one housing shortage, the historical legacy of our focus on single family homes in the middle of the last century. Okay, does upzoning work? We are almost done here. Well, sort of. This is a long article, but it's good. Does upzoning work? Because upzoning of single-family residential land is a relatively new phenomenon, the land markets and regulations differ from city to city. There are a few studies that analyze the effects. There is also very little data from pro-upzoning lawmakers on how many units their legislation can or would create, since the housing market is unpredictable, right? Let's see the data. Oregon and Minneapolis are going to be our guinea pigs, Schutz says. Now that they've got this new legislation, how quickly does the housing market start to respond? Are we seeing increased housing of the kinds that we wanted? Are we seeing enough of that to absorb demand? Is there political backlash? Will they try to walk back some of these changes? All good questions. According to Schutz, the value of upzoning lies in areas where land value is high, where developers already want to build, and where additional units will generate a profit for whoever owns the land. However, when general increase upzoning has been introduced into these markets, it hasn't resulted in enough development to make a significant impact on housing affordability. That's an interesting point, and I go back to my other statement. Just because the government allows something doesn't mean the free market, the private market developers are going to do it, because they're smarter than that, right? For example, Washington, D.C. has had relatively little ADU construction since its upzoning law passed in 2017. Less than 100 units per year have been approved by the city. Really wealthy homeowners are not interested in creating ADUs in their backyard. But they've also run into other problems, particularly with basement apartments. It's not the zoning code, it's the building code. A basement apartment has to have a minimum 7-foot ceiling to be considered an apartment. There are a lot of basements that don't meet that requirement, and it's really expensive to dig an extra foot in your basement. I bet. In 1997, Portland, Oregon changed its permitting and zoning rules to allow ADUs, relaxing its regulations, and has only resulted in modest uptake. In 2016, the city issued only 600 permits for ADUs, not enough to shift the supply curve in a meaningful way, according to Herbert. The way we think of this kind of upzoning is it's not the solution for affordability, but it's a solution to add housing to these built environments, he says, right? We're finding that it does not affect affordability, right? In all the articles, they allude to something like that, or most of them. Herbert is also skeptical about upzoning's impact on affordability, since the housing market is structured to maximize profit. See? A lot of cities are saying, let's open the spigots, we'll build so much housing, we'll get to the point where we get vacancies, Herbert says. But if developers see vacancies rise, they will stop building. It's the nature of our capitalistic system. See? Really great insights in this article. Let me continue. Meanwhile, the definition of success in upzoning is subjective. First, there's the question of whether upzoning will result in more construction. Then there's the question of whether or not the new construction will help make housing affordable. Upzoning reduces the cost per unit for land, since the cost of land is spread over more units. Changing the zoning code to allow more housing doesn't necessarily mean new housing will be built if other regulations like building codes, setbacks, ceiling heights, etc., and the permitting process make it too expensive for developers to build. Plus, the construction labor shortage is pushing the cost of building even higher. That's a factor we don't often hear, right? Are you going to find enough people to actually build homes? It's a struggle now. This is one of the reasons why all new housing is constructed is so expensive. That's true, right? They got to pay those people to do that. In general, developers are going to seek the highest profit possible. That's what they're supposed to do, Herbert says. Now we're building a lot of high-end housing because the development process is constrained. Developers are going to build at the highest point of the market they can because they're the few projects that get through, right? I mean, if I was a developer, I'd want to build a high-end, or a realtor, they want to sell high-end because your profit margins are so much bigger. The potential for getting more housing through upzoning varies a lot across different geographies, Schutz says. If a neighborhood is zoned to allow an 8-story but demand is only for a 4-story building, for example, developers will only construct a 4-story building. I'm hoping that state and local governments are thinking about their own markets and trying to figure out where this is the appropriate policy and where there's something else they should be doing. Schutz believes that there are high housing demand cities like DC and Chicago where land use laws already allow denser housing to be constructed. But because the process is too expensive and it takes too long, developers don't do it. Many factors, my friends, many factors. We haven't focused much on the regulatory process as much as the bans on multifamily housing. And I think to be effective in increasing housing supply, we're going to have to tackle both of them, he says, adding that there is a research gap in how much regulations impede development. Another issue with the housing market is that new market rate housing will never be affordable to low income and extremely low income renters, millions of whom earn $7,500 a year or less. Yikes. These are strategies to affect the broad middle of the market for the moderate income household, but it's not going to bring housing into the reach of the poorest household, right? I mean, yikes. Herbert says, subsidies such as housing vouchers for renters or tax credits for developers would be needed to bridge the gap. And the gap is growing every day, right? Go look at the price of homes versus the increase in home price versus the increase in wages price, and you will drop on the floor. It's appalling. It's crazy. Some progressive housing groups are voicing their concerns about upzoning's impacts on low-income and extremely low-income families. Moms for Housing, an anti-displacement affordable housing advocacy group started by homeless women that took over a vacant investor-owned house in West Oakland, protested California's SB 50 because they believe the bill will lead to more luxury, market rate housing and gentrification, and won't do enough to help people like them in terms of affordable housing creation. And I would concur with that based on what we're finding here in this series. Carol Fief, director of the Oakland San Francisco Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment and a spokesperson for Moms for Housing, takes issue with SB 50's emphasis on market rate housing. She believes new housing must be targeted toward people who earn minimum wage. We need housing for people who make less than $40 an hour, she tells Curbed. She advocates for amending the California Constitution to declare housing a human right, which would then inspire lawmakers to get creative about how to achieve it. We're all on the verge of being housing insecure if the markets are allowed to continue to move in the way that they've been moving, Fife says. That is a very real statement and something we need to be, conscious of. We all need housing, so why don't we safeguard something that should be a human right for everybody by changing the law for everybody? See, my only problem with that is, again, governments are overburdened right now trying to solve all the problems that are existing in the world. I don't know that they're going to be they have the capacity or the ability to solve the housing problem. I mean, they got a lot on their plate as it is. Alliance for Community Transit, a group that advocates for equitable transit-oriented communities, announced that it will oppose SB 50 unless it includes amendments that address gentrification. Unless it is amended to include strong and enforceable provisions to prevent direct displacement, support community planning in sensible communities, and include strong affordable housing standards with deep affordability levels commensurate with the density provided through the bill's incentives. Even the staunchest proponents of upzoning acknowledge limitations, but reckon the legislation is still essential to tackling the affordability crisis. Yikes. Kind of the, hey, let's just go for it anyway. That always works out. Not. Upzoning by itself is not enough, says California YIMBY's Brian Hanlow. It's not going to solve the affordability crisis for everyone and not on a timescale that will help everyone. We need a whole panoply of legislation. That's a word you don't hear all the time. The panoply that Hanlow refers to is the 3 Ps. Housing production through legislation that makes it easier to add housing supply, preservation of affordable housing like rent stabilization laws, and protection for people who are already in affordable housing like right to counsel laws for people facing eviction, which New York City is experimenting with. Zoning isn't the same as comprehensive planning, says Schutz, believes that targeted and direct approaches to addressing the housing shortage, like trying state funding to having a housing plan are needed to incentivize production versus blanket directives like upzoning an entire state or city. That's important. Like I was telling you, doing it as a big chunk, it seems like a very bad idea to me. Quote, I would like cities and states not to try to fix zoning piecemeal. I would like cities and states not to try to fix zoning piecemeal with lift the ban on multifamily let's ADUs. She says, I would rather they give local governments quantitative targets for how much housing they ought to produce. We can look at things like rate of population growth and job growth and get a sense of the places that really aren't building enough housing to keep up with demand. Give them a target and then give them some financial carrots and sticks to keep them accountable. This section is titled Who Supports and Who Opposes Upzoning. While most people can agree that there's an affordable housing shortage, there's a disagreement on how best to address it. Older homeowners from both sides of the political spectrum oppose new housing and are disproportionately represented at community meetings that discuss zoning. Progressive housing groups often oppose upzoning since it doesn't address the systemic inequalities at the root of the affordable housing crisis and relies on trickle-down economic theory. In Minneapolis, a number of different interest groups came together to support upzoning: environmental activists, senior citizens, trade unions, and the city planning department. However, the Audubon Society Minneapolis chapter is challenging the city's upzoning plan, arguing that the city didn't conduct proper environmental review. I buy it. Again, cities don't have enough time to cross all the T's and dot the I's. I mean, we're asking so much of them, and things are going to get missed. And when that happens, we're all going to pay the price. You know, this is a like all hands on deck team effort kind of a theme. In Oregon, some cities expressed concerns about the extra pressure on their infrastructure. Arguments opposed to new housing frequently cite changes in neighborhood character as reasons why legislation shouldn't be passed, right? We talked about that in the second video, I believe, talking about how, the area that was a Chinatown area with quaint shops and bubble tea shops and restaurants becomes gentrified, and those, ethnic, niceties get pushed out. It's sad. The idea of preserving neighborhood character is nicely vague enough that it can cover lots of things without being very explicit, Shute says. They're worried about changing the feel of the neighborhood with taller buildings, but for many people, this is also the type of person who lives in the neighborhood. If it's white and wealthy and mostly nuclear families, there are places that would like to keep that. And they don't have to say, we want to keep out black people. They just have to say, we want to preserve the neighborhood character. Now let's correlate that with what we found in the first article, the article from NYC NoHo Soho. They said those areas after upzoning were whiter, wealthier, and more crowded. So you're going to hear stuff from both sides of the aisle. Again, this is a very contested argument. Housing advocates who fear displacement and gentrification, like Oakland's Moms for Housing, are also concerned about changes to neighborhood character upzoning might accelerate. California State Senate candidate Jackie Fielder is running on a social justice platform. Housing is a major part of the agenda, and she signed the Homes Guarantee Pledge, which includes repositioning housing to a human right rather than a commodity. She has criticized SB 50 for its reliance on trickle-down economic theory. It focuses on market rate housing, and it lacks attention to affordable housing creation and protection for vulnerable communities. This is a quote: "We need to build for need, not for profit." Great. Who are you going to find to do that, right? You're going to put that burden on the taxpayers, or are you just going to find some benevolent and potentially not very bright developer to build for need and forego the profit? Good luck. Fielder recently said, there's a lot of things I would like to see done in the world too, but who's going to pay for it, right? I mean, I'm tapped out. So if you want to find someone, go for it. And with the fifth largest economy in the world, with 157 billionaires worth more than 700 billion combined, California has all the resources we need to do it. Go for it. See if you can shake them down. Good luck with that. In New York City, upzonings in Inwood and Bushwick, which have high percentages of Latino residents, have been halted in the wake of concerns about displacement. Advocates and politicians are calling for racial impact studies of rezonings. Good on them. Yeah, get those studies, because we have found that it does displace racial and low income and middle income people. No one is pretending that we don't need housing, says Sylvia Morse, an urban planner and co-author of the book Zoned Out, Displacements and Planning in New York City. It's a question of what housing are we building? And especially in such hot land markets like New York City, if you are not regulating and if you're not making commitments to it and investments, particularly investments in land that is in the public domain, the private sector will only try to maximize profit, and that is what it is there to do. To Morse, the housing shortage problem is deeper than just supply and demand and extends to systemic issues of ownership and control, which are tied to race and class. I can see where they'd say that, but I just personally, I don't always going back to race and class and always going back to the things that we've done in the past. I don't really see that solves the problem. Like, yeah, we have that in our past, right? Do we need to continue to go back there? Let's look at the situation now and solve the problems now. Zoning on its own is not going to be able to address those deep questions of ownership, control, resources, intergenerational wealth, all of those things that are tied into the places where people live, Morse says. All zoning says is here's the kind of use that can go here, and here's how big it can be. That's all it says. And that is too blunt a tool to address affordability. That's an awesome statement right there. And again, what we're finding, right, that we're asking too much of zoning and not being really conscious about the collateral damage that can come of that. Let's see here. And that is too blunt a tool to address affordability without being paired with public land commitment, without some forms of cooperative governance, without a reparative framework. We're not going to be able to address the actual underlying housing crisis. To Schutz, gentrification and displacement shows why comprehensive planning and not just rezonings are needed. If you live in a neighborhood where there's a bunch of new construction going on and then the rents in the new buildings are higher than the old building, it's hard not to look at that and say the neighborhood is changing and more affluent people are moving in, Schutz says. What's hard is that we're often missing the larger regional context. So individual neighborhoods in hot urban areas are seeing a fair amount of housing. Most of those regions haven't been building housing to keep up with demand for 30 years. Well, you're suppressing new housing in 80% of the city where you can't change what's there. In the 20% of the city that's allowed new development, that's absorbing all the demand. Of course, the rents are going to go up there. The future of upzoning and the housing crisis. Okay, this is one of the last couple sections. At the heart of the upzoning debate is a seemingly simple question. Can we provide more affordable housing solely by allowing for more construction? But the real question is much deeper. Can we build our way out of a crisis that's the product of an economic system that extracts as much as it can from most individuals in order to enrich a few? That's an awesome question. One of the things that I never hear people talk about, or rarely hear people talk about in the housing situation, is inflation, right? The dollar is in deep trouble. Some even believe that it's at the end of its life cycle. So are we really going to be able to stop the impending collapse that is inevitable, right? Once currency reaches a certain percentage of debt to GDP, it never comes back. I don't believe the dollar's ever coming back. It's only going to go down until it completely collapses. So we're trying to chase something that is part of a bigger, is in the little ecosystem of a bigger thing, right? You have to have a roof over your head, Harvard's Christopher Herbert says. As Matthew Desmond said in his book Evicted, the rent eats first. As long as you have that primacy of housing in terms of the pecking order and expenses, it will push rents higher. Today's housing crisis is the result of decades of policy decisions at the local, state, and federal levels on land use, transportation, taxes, and labor. It's bigger than zoning. I am so glad they said that. It is bigger than zoning. But because zoning is one of the few aspects of the way we live that's under local control, it's where local legislators who are on the front line of the crisis are acting. Man, government's going to pull the simplest lever, push the simplest button, and expect it to do everything. And it's just not going to do that. Upzoning is challenging a symbol of American homeownership, the single family home that has been subsidized by the government for over a century, and that remains a major source of wealth for millions of people. The real debate around upzoning is an ideological reckoning over whether housing is a commodity or a right. Solutions that fail to address this question cannot solve the housing crisis. Quote, we've got to decommodify housing, Fife says. We've got to take the profit motive out of essential needs. That's the biggest fight. We need to figure out other ways for investors to make money that don't rely on the things that people need to survive. We shouldn't be able to commodify air, water, and housing. Make money off Jordan's not housing. So here's my take on that. That's fine. It's the same thing with gun legislation, right? You want to take away guns from law-abiding citizens, but criminals are going to have the guns. Let's apply that here. You want to decommodify housing for individuals, but it's just fine and dandy for BlackRock and Vanguard and private equity firms to own housing and then rent that to people. Bullshit. Like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? They always going to take away from individuals and give it to institutional investors or the government or private equity firms. No, it's not going to happen. That's ridiculous, right? That's a silly thing to say. Anyway, I could go off on a tangent there, but that's the article. Stay tuned for the next video. We got about 4 more to go here, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.